Still, it's great to see all of you in here, and primarily this section is going to be talking about different kinds of fruit. And we are going to start off with apples and pears. And I will be giving that presentation, so it's good to be back with you again. In these sessions on product considerations, we're going to talk a lot about the biology of these crop groups and some of the things you want to think about when you're using them or sourcing them for fresh cut. And we'll talk about what's known about recommendations for maintaining the quality of fresh cut products. But of course, you out there in the industry have direct experience with that. So to the extent that you're willing to share, we would love to have you join in the conversation when we get to the end of the presentation and talking about kind of what works and what doesn't work. So, apples and pears. So actually apples, as you probably know, are one of the more common fresh cut fruit items and have been pretty successfully launched into the marketplace in a number of different formats. And we have in the past tried to classify different kinds of fresh cut fruit according to their potential post-cutting life. And this this recommendation was put together a number of years ago, and I think commercially some people have been able to exceed these post-cutting life optimums that we had put together, but it still shows that apples are one of the fruit that has the longer shelf life potential after cutting, along with several others. And then we'll be talking about pears a little bit later, and they generally have a shorter post-cutting shelf life because there's some additional challenges with pears. So we will cover all of that as we move through these two crops. So there are many varieties of apples to choose from. For fresh cut, I think people tend to focus on a couple different varieties that seem to work well and are readily available, but there are a lot of apples to choose from. When we're harvesting apples from an orchard, generally, unless you're contracting directly with a grower who's going to harvest your fruit, the fruit are being harvested with the fresh market in mind. And apples are one of the crops that tend to be stored the longest, can be more than a year depending on the variety. So the harvester or the grower, when he tries to decide when to harvest, he's trying to maximize that storage life, but he also wants to maximize any red color on the skin, which may or may not be relevant for you depending on whether you leave the skin on your cut product. And then the sensory quality. So he wants good crispness, good flavor and sweetness, and generally also wants big size. For the fresh market, large fruit are best. He wants to minimize softening and definitely mealiness, which can still be an issue for organic apples. Most conventional apples, if you're using 1 MCP, mealiness is no longer an issue. And then there's a variety of disorders that apples can get. And so there's this balance between trying to pick the best harvest date that's going to maximize the benefits and minimize the possible problems. And the problems are exacerbated because we store apples such a long time. So one important indicator of harvest maturity is starch content. And we usually measure this by staining with a solution of iodide and potassium iodine. And it stains the starch granules a blackish purple color. And so this is an example of a starch chart for Granny Smith apples showing fruit where the starch is just starting to clear all the way through to fully ripe with no starch left. So years ago in California, we used to recommend harvesting apples between a 2 and a 3 for long-term storage. This gave you long storage life, but it also gave you good eating quality. Some later recommendations are having people harvest more in this range here, where the starch is just starting to clear. Now for fresh cut, if you're sourcing fruit directly from the orchard, you might prefer to have something that has more of the starch already degraded into sugars, depending on how quickly you're going to process. That starch will convert to sugars in cold storage, usually within a week, so it doesn't take too long for that to happen. Now, apples are also very commonly stored in controlled atmospheres, and they can be stored for as short as 1.5 months up to 12 months. And again, this is for fresh market. If you wanted to store for less than 1.5 months, you could do that, but generally the benefits don't warrant the cost. And then the oxygen level really can be as low as 0.5% up to 3%, with carbon dioxide between 0.5 and 4%, and that depends on the variety. And what the controlled atmosphere storage will do is it maintains the fruit in a condition more similar to at harvest. So it keeps the firmness high, keeps the green background color, keeps the acidity high, which can be important for fresh cut. And it does all this by reducing the respiration and ethylene production of the fruit, and also the response of the fruit to ethylene. It can reduce some of the storage disorders that can develop, but it can cause some storage problems. And one such storage problem that would be especially challenging for fresh cut operations is internal browning. This can happen in some varieties, and it's exacerbated by CA storage, and especially at higher CO2 levels. So Fuji apple is susceptible, and actually in California, many storage operators just use air storage, maybe with 1 MCP for Fuji's these days. Pink Lady is also susceptible, as is Brayburn. So if you're using any of those varieties, you want to be careful about this. Storage scald is a challenge on some varieties. Granny Smith is one that's quite susceptible to it. It usually doesn't develop until after 3 or 4 months of cold storage in air, and it's just it's a discoloration on the skin. If it's really severe, it'll go into the first couple cell layers, but it could be a problem for your fresh cut product, depending on how you're processing it. Bitter pit also, I think, could be a challenge. This disorder is related to calcium nutrition in the fruit, and it generally develops within the first month of cold storage. Can develop on the tree, but it's not as common, but depending on the variety, like I know Honeycrisp, I think, can have it on the tree as well. So obviously you don't want your fruit to be developing bitter pit after you've processed it and put it into a package. Good calcium nutrition in the field and also just managing the vigor of the trees can help to reduce this. Also, calcium treatments post-harvest to the whole fruit can be helpful. Another challenge to fresh cut could be water core in the apples. This happens when the sugar alcohol, which is the way sugars are transported from the leaves to the apples, accumulates in between the cells in the apples and gives them a water-soaked appearance. The apples are actually quite sweet and tasty, but the problem is, I think in a fresh cut product, it's going to look unsightly. And secondly, in long-term storage of whole fruit, that glassy tissue can turn brown and develop off flavors. So many of these things that I'm showing, especially the internal ones, they're the kind of thing where you're going to want to do some sampling of the fruit that you're purchasing to make sure that you don't have water core or internal browning to deal with. Usually if you would cut a subsample, you'd be able to pick it up. So I mentioned Smart Fresh or 1 MCP a couple of times. Apples are the one crop where this product is used most commonly and quite effectively. It's applied at the time of harvest within the storage room, and it prevents ethylene from having effects on the fruit. So it maintains firmness and acidity. Luckily, though, it doesn't affect the starch conversion to sugar, so the fruit still gets sweet. And it definitely controls mealiness and reduces storage scald. So unless you're dealing with an organic product, this probably would be a good tool to have used on your fresh cut product prior to cutting. So with these products, we have developed visual quality scores that we use to assess the quality, with 9 being the best and 1 being inedible. And of course, there are differences between cultivars in their browning potential. This is just an example of some different cultivars showing tissue browning. Of course, we have the new Arctic apples, if anybody wants to venture into that don't brown nearly at all. And then, so I have just a little bit of data here. This was a study done back in 2014, where they were looking at the sensory quality of fresh cut apples that they had treated with 1 MCP, so they were all stored in controlled atmospheres, but some also had a 1 MCP treatment when they were whole apples. And then they prepared fresh cut slices and looked at the quality after a period of time. And so we have a appearance score. There's really no effect here. Texture, we see for some of the varieties with the 1 MCP, we're maintaining a higher texture compared to just CA alone. And then we also see a little bit of difference in the flavor score, not so consistent though. And then overall quality is a little bit better, just a little bit better by adding 1 MCP along with CA. If you had compared to air and 1 MCP, I think the differences would have been much bigger. So years ago, some work was done here at UC Davis looking at different kinds of treatments to control browning in cut apple slices. And this was really some of the early work that was done before this was a commercial product. The fresh cut apples were not on the market at the time. And so I was looking at different levels of ascorbic acid, and these were just little discs of apple flesh that were held in these dishes. So, you can see that really at about 1%, maybe 2%, we're sort of maximizing the effect of the ascorbic acid. That was with a 1 to 2 minute dip. And of course, some of that work probably paved the way, along with other research that was done in Florida and at USDA in the development of NatureSeal, which you're probably all familiar with and have heard about already yesterday. But apples and pears are both on the label for this particular product, which is calcium ascorbate. They did look at low oxygen atmospheres for delaying the browning of apples, but what they found was that you had to pretty much use 0% oxygen, 100% nitrogen to prevent the browning of the fruit. And of course, that's too dangerous to do. So low oxygen really is not a good mechanism for controlling browning, because you just have to get to a very low level of oxygen. Yes?
Are they ascorbic acid testing? There were taste tests?
I'm not sure if there were in that particular study. There have been with some other fruits that I'm aware of. I'm sure someone has done it. Yeah, 2% you're starting, sometimes you can get into some off flavors depending on the product. Good question. So this is kind of the overall recommendation that that we came out with, that for, you should use apple cultivars that have lower browning potential, and I think also cultivars that maintain their firmness well. Use CA stored or 1 MCP treated apples so that they maintain their crispness better. And then 1 to 2% ascorbic acid, 1% calcium chloride or calcium lactate. Generally a high OTR film, because the low oxygen's not really helping too much, and don't let the CO2 get too high. 0 degrees, and at that time we were saying 10 to 14 days. I know people are going probably 30 days, maybe 45 days, 60 days. How many days? on apples? What's the longest?
40.
40.
Between 20 and 40.
20 to 40. Okay. Okay, so that's it on fresh cut apples. So I'm going to shift over to the European pears, which are a little more challenging, I would say, than fresh cut apples. And part of the reason they're a little more challenging is that pears are not generally eaten completely unripe, right? Consumers like them either partially ripe or fully ripe, and so that adds to the challenge, as with many of our fruit. Apples are just a unique and easy product because you don't have to, they're pretty easily ripened and they don't change that much in terms of texture when they're ripe. All right, so similar kind of hedonic scale for pears. The thing we see with fresh cut pears when they start to deteriorate is they get overly soft and they get sort of, the edges are no longer crisp, right? They look sort of fluffy on the ends, and of course they get a lot of browning. So those two problems are a challenge. There are some differences between cultivars in terms of browning potential, but pretty much every pear I've ever seen browns reasonably well. So it's definitely something you have to treat for. There are differences in the respiration rate and ethylene production by different types of pears, which certainly can enter into your calculations for what kind of package you need, but can also influence the tendency to soften. And so the Bartlett pear is the blue line, and hopefully right away you see that Bartlett has a higher carbon dioxide production, so higher respiration rate, and also the highest ethylene production rate. And it is one of the more challenging varieties. It's a summer pear as compared to a winter pear that the other varieties are. And so that can affect its shelf life after ripening. So this is some data looking at changes in visual color and quality of pears. So here we have overall quality. This is related to browning, so the color of the flesh, and then firmness. And so we're looking at 4 different varieties here. We have Anjou, which is in pink, Bartlett in blue, Bosc in green, and red Anjou in orange. And so here we're looking at overall quality. And interestingly, on overall quality, we find that the Bosc and the Bartlett have better overall quality, and it's primarily because of the browning issue. And again here, I'm not sure what treatment was put on these fruits, so if you're able to control the browning, that would affect these results. But in this study, the Anjou pears showed much more browning compared to the Bosc and the Bartlett, and so that's what pushed the quality into the unacceptable range. In terms of firmness, though, you do see that the Anjou pears maintain firmness much higher, especially well, in this case it was the red Anjou that was the highest, and Bartlett is the softest.
Is there a reason they did that 10 degrees instead of colder?
It was probably a bit misguided to do it at 10. My guess is they have data at 5 as well. And I probably should dig that out for the next presentation because, yeah, obviously this is all going to be much slower in terms of the changes at a lower temperature. And that's a very unacceptable temperature. So, good catch. Okay, so this is some data with Bartlett that I developed in my lab a couple of years ago. We were looking at the quality of whole pears and developing ripening scenarios for the fruit. And we were looking at how the firmness of the fruit was related to the sensory quality. So we had a trained panel that assessed the juiciness, the butteriness, and the aroma, the pear aroma in the fruit. And we had fruit at 3 different firmness levels, 6, 4, and 2, which are, when we're talking about fresh cut, these are all pretty low firmness levels. But the point I want to make is, So in this case, with the sensory score, the higher the number, that means more juicy, more buttery, more pear aroma. And you can see that as you decrease the firmness, these components are all increasing. So it's not like there's nothing here. There's less juiciness at 6 pounds, but we're about mid-scale for pear aroma and a little under that for butteriness. But generally, as the fruit gets softer, the sensory quality does get better. And here's some data. Now, in this case, we're at 0 degrees or 32, so that's good. Looking at the overall quality of pears when they are cut at different ripeness levels. So pink is fully ripe, which was 7 to 10 pounds. Partially ripe was 10 to 13 pounds, that's the blue line, and then mature green is the green line, that's 13 to 16 pounds, so essentially not so much any ripening, just harvested from the tree. And so you do see that the ripe fruit in this particular scenario did have a fairly short shelf life before it went below the limit of marketability. But the good news is the partially ripe and the mature green were pretty similar in terms of their shelf life. So it should definitely be possible to work with partially ripe fruit. And of course, the goal is to try to get to something that's closer to ripe if possible. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how to ripen pears because pears are a bit challenging to ripen if you've ever worked with them. Pears generally won't ripen without a little bit of assistance after harvest. Either they need to be in cold storage for a period of time, or they need to be exposed to ethylene. In some cases, they need both. During the ripening process, we know that the temperature needs to be at least 55 degrees or higher if you want to have reasonably quick ripening. When you get below 55, ripening gets very slow. And then ethylene exposure to kickstart the process, 100 parts per million is plenty. So this picture is a good example of what can happen if you just harvest fruit and put them at ambient temperatures. These pears were harvested in July and then placed at 68 Fahrenheit for 8 days, and they didn't ripen at all. They were still very firm and green. If we gave them 1 day of ethylene exposure and then left them for 7 days at 68 degrees, they ripened fully and turned yellow. Now these were California pears. This doesn't happen quite as much up in Washington, I think because you have more cold temperatures before harvest, but it's not unheard of. And it does happen with other varieties in Washington. So Anjou, definitely. Camise as well. Okay, so so just to go back to that. So there's a lot of information that's been developed on how much cold and how much ethylene is needed to really get good ripening of Anjou, Camise, and Bartlett and Bosc. So if you need that kind of information, I'd be happy to share it if you don't already know where to find it. Okay, so this data relates to the comment I made a minute ago about the rate of fruit ripening. So you'll see that there's a big break between, this is 50 degrees fruit temperature, and this is 54 degrees, 54.5 Fahrenheit. So between those two temperatures, which is that's barely a difference. We were trying to find something in between, and we never could quite get the temperature where we wanted it. There's a big difference in the rate of ripening. But in any case, within these temperatures, within this range of, say, 55 to 68, you can adjust the rate of ripening slightly by adjusting the temperature of the fruit. So if you're trying to get fruit to a certain firmness level for processing, then you can adjust that a bit by playing with the temperatures. Unfortunately, I don't have data for any other fruit besides Bartlett on this, but the response should be similar. And I would imagine for some varieties, it might be even a little bit more different between temperatures. Another factor with pears is, like apples, they are often stored under controlled atmospheres. And pears are stored in CA storage very commonly, not quite as long as apples, but can be up to 9 months depending on the variety. Again, 1 to 3% oxygen. CO2 we usually try to keep pretty low in CA storage because pears will develop internal browning with high CO2. So we try to keep that pretty low. Just like with apples, it reduces respiration and the effects of ethylene, reduces the storage scald, helps to keep the little bit of acidity that's in the fruit present, but it can induce internal browning. So this is just a comparison just to show, in fact, these were only stored under low oxygen, and after 6 months, just a tremendous difference in the quality of the fruit. But more importantly to you is that fruit sourced out of low oxygen storage has a different response post-cutting when you make a fresh cut product out of it. So this data is actually showing a couple factors. We have production area. So in California, we have Sacramento and Lake County regions where pears are produced. So Sacramento is near here, Lake County is further north. And then we have the fruit was stored in air or at 2% oxygen, and they were stored either no time or up to 4 months. And so what this data is showing us is the shelf life of the slices that came from those fruit. And so first of all, you see that over time, the shelf life is decreasing. So the longer the fruit are in storage, the less post-cutting life you might have. Is there a question?
You have to have data as far as what pressure they were spliced at.
That's a very, off the top of my head, I don't remember, but I will find that out and I'll let you know before tomorrow's over. Yeah, that's a very important factor. My guess is it probably was around 10 pounds, but I'll let you know. So we see this decrease with time. The other thing to note, though, is that the low oxygen stored fruit, especially in Lake County, had higher shelf life compared to the air stored fruit. And we also saw a little bit of a trend, especially at later storage times, in better shelf life of the cut product from the fruit at the Lake County district as compared to the Sacramento district. So it could be differences in the firmness of the fruit at harvest, maybe differences in phenolic content in those fruit, or I will dig out more details about this study because I think you're that's a very good question and a very important question, so I'll come back to you with that. So this is what the fruit looked like. So yeah, you can see after 5 months, the air stored fruit is showing more browning. So maybe if you have a real effective anti-browning agent, you can overcome this difference. In CA, you can see they had very little browning. Okay. So as with apples, we haven't seen significant benefits of modified atmospheres for fresh cut pears. Now, these were not, years and years of studies, but there were a couple studies done that didn't really show a significant delay in softening or browning. And of course, if you get above 5% CO2, that could cause some damage to pear slices in terms of internal browning. 1-MCP in pears. This is a complicated topic. There's been interest in 1-MCP to extend the shelf life of pears. It's been really challenging to use effectively. I've done years and years and years of research on this, primarily with Bartlett, but other people have worked with Anjou and Camise, and the challenge is finding out the right concentration to use to get some delay in softening without completely locking up the fruit. It's very easy to just inhibit softening for a very long time. The other challenge is sometimes it's hard to get any effect at all. If you're trying to treat fruit that are already producing some ethylene and you treat them in an enclosed container, it doesn't take much ethylene production by the fruit to completely negate the effects of 1-MCP. So you have both of these challenges going on, one eliminating the effect and the other one, the effect being too strong. So, I can certainly see how it could be a benefit for fresh cut fruit, but I think you have to figure out if there's some way to make it work after you get the fruit to the firmness level you want. Maybe the sachets that are out in the market now could, if they were inside your fresh cut container and constantly giving off 1-MCP, maybe that could work, but it would have to be a higher concentration than the ethylene that would be accumulating from the fruit. Because if it's a 1-to-1 ratio between ethylene and 1-MCP, you're not going to see any effect. You have to have more 1-MCP than ethylene. We did do an interesting study, however. I don't know how important or relevant this data is, but we did a study because we really wanted to know how does 1-MCP affect the flavor of the fruit. Because everyone was saying it inhibits the flavor of the fruit. So what we did is we took Bartlett pears. Some were untreated, that would be the green line. Some were treated with ethylene to stimulate the ripening, like I described earlier. That would be the red line. And then some were treated with 1-MCP as a gas, 600 parts per billion. So, and then we ripened the fruit. And we assessed so this is the firmness of the fruit. And you can see that, of course, the ones treated with ethylene ripened faster than the ones we did not treat. And the 1-MCP fruit took a long time to soften, over 3 weeks, till they finally were fully soft. Dense.
Was this Delta fruit or Lake County?
I think they were Lake County. So about 3 weeks to get fully ripe, about 2 weeks to get to 8 pounds. So then we looked at the flavor quality of those fruit, and we assessed them all at the exact same firmness stage. I think it was about 3 pounds, so fully ripe. And this is what's called a spider plot. It's basically comparing these treatments. And we're looking at characteristics like overall intensity of aroma, apple aroma, pear aroma, firmness, juiciness. And what we found was that the 1-MCP treated fruit, when they finally ripened, had the best flavor quality, hands down. They had the most aroma intensity, the most pear aroma, the sweetest taste. They were low in apple aroma, which you generally don't want in a pear, low in fermented aroma compared to the other two treatments. So we have some ideas about why this might happen, and I don't know if this would ever be practically implemented, but it is interesting to see if you wait long enough for that fruit to really be ripe, it actually can taste better.
Could you accelerate the ripeness along with temperature?
Could you accelerate the ripening with temperature? We haven't tried temperature, although these were ripened at 68 degrees. Yeah, with a pear, you wouldn't want to go much more than maybe 75, 78. We have tried to use ethylene to get fruit to come out of 1-MCP, and for me, it hasn't really worked very well. Okay, so now I have some of this older data. Again, this was all done, fresh cut pears have sort of been in and out of the market for the last 5 years. I think they're back in now, which is exciting to see, but this data was collected probably in the mid-1990s before anybody had, I think, really started doing fresh cut fruit. So here again with Bartlett pears, looking at different levels of ascorbic acid, and this is the color of the fruit. So the lower value is brownish, and then this is more white flesh. So it's interesting to see that in this case they were showing an increase, sorry, not, well, the color was staying quite white, even some lightening perhaps, from 2% ascorbic acid. And then there's a very nice dose response for the other levels of ascorbic acid. But again, keeping in mind the possible flavor effects from going too high.
And do you know the exposure time on this as well to the AS?
I think these were like a 1 to 2 minute dip, so it's a little bit long. Here we have calcium lactate on firmness. So here we're looking at calcium, and again, as a dose response, the more calcium you add, the greater the firmness. And this was after a period of time after cutting. I think it was 7 days after cutting. But basically just to show that calcium really can inhibit the loss of firmness of the fruit, but you know, there's a limit to how far you can go before you get into sensory issues. Okay, so here we go. These are 2 minute dips for browning reduction, and looking at some different mixtures. This one, I thought I was going to take this slide out because cysteine, well, it was looked at commercially in the laboratory then. It's not a product that's available, it's very expensive, and it's not registered. So these mixtures that have cysteine are not something you can do, even though this one looks great. But you can see some benefits from the ascorbic acid and the calcium lactate. All right, so I know some products in the past, or some operators who were working with fresh cut pears have used Nature Seal in the past. It is registered. I know that I just learned that the patent on this has recently expired, so there's lots of other people in the market coming up with different kinds of products. I think that's great. Gives you more options, but it also means you've got more work to do because you've got to test all those things and see what's going to work best for you. But I would say that the calcium and the ascorbate have been pretty well proven to work quite well, but there may be some other options out there as well. So the general specifications then are, and again, this was based on work done quite some time ago, to use partially ripened pears, 10 to 13 pounds. I should say, I did some fresh cut work, just a very small little pilot test, and we also, even with using Nature Seal, we were finding it very difficult to go any softer than this and still have a product that looked good after 7 days. If you should use CA stored fruit whenever possible. You could consider 1 MCP, but I think it probably should only be used as a post-cutting or at least post-ripening kind of treatment, because it's just too risky to buy fruit and think you're going to ripen it if it's been treated with 1 MCP. This size seemed to work best in the testing that was done. So 110 to 150 fruit per carton box. 2% ascorbic acid and 1% calcium lactate or Nature Seal seem to be the best recipe. Again, a high OTR film because low oxygen didn't have much benefit, and stay below 2% on the CO2.
So what cutting method were you using on this? Were you just using like
These were hand cut.
hand cut?
Yeah. Storage 0 or as close to 0 is feasible. And then in this case, we were only getting 1 to 2 weeks of shelf life. So when I gave this talk last year, I showed this slide. I showed some different products that include fresh cut pears. These were pretty green, but they were on the market. And this one had been recently in the market, this root fruit. Well, at least as far as I can tell, these are all off the market right now. But the good news is that there's a new product that was just launched in 2019, so that's exciting, and they won an innovation award at United Fresh, so that's exciting as well. Congratulations. And I heard this week that there's another product that's hopefully soon going to be on the market. So fresh cut pears is up and coming. It's really challenging. I'm so excited though to see people working on this and making a go of it. So I wish you every success with that. So as you think about apples and you think about pears, the important thing to remember, even with fresh cut, is that fruit quality, the initial fruit quality definitely determines the ripened and the fresh cut quality. So, and don't use Red Delicious. They're so sad. Questions or comments? I know there's some experience in the room. I'm not going to make anybody talk if they don't want to, but if you want to share something, fine, or if you have a question, let me know.